I think we are going. Hello. Today I'm here with Michael Erlewine. Michael, welcome to the Into the Mystic podcast.
Thanks. Glad to
All
be
right.
here.
This is very exciting for me. We had a few moments to touch base before I started recording here. But for the benefit of the people listening today, I'm a big fan of yours. And like we discussed, you probably don't know who I am. So this is gonna be kind of fun to get to know each other right here on the podcast. We really haven't been able to speak in person, but I followed your work for many years, and it's a real pleasure to speak with you today.
Oh, me too. Happy to get to know you.
Yeah.
So what do you want to talk about?
Well, it just occurred to me. So I like how this is flowing. I would love to talk about, as you have so many things we could talk about, but there's one particular field of yours which you also happen to be an expert in, and that is your astrology, and it's something that I particularly don't know much about, and most of my efforts to dive into it, I get overwhelmed rather quickly with how that works and how we can gain knowledge from astrological symbolisms and from things that are happening in the cosmos. I don't really have an idea of how that works, although I have many times been absolutely blown away by some of the things that have been brought to me by people who claim to have knowledge or that have pulled knowledge from there. And they talk about things that are happening in my life that just seem to be too synchronistic to be coincidence, if you will. So if you wouldn't mind, I would love to talk about that a little bit and your history with that. I know you're very well known in astrological circles. Maybe talk about your history a little bit with that. And then if you
Sure.
wouldn't mind explaining to us what your beliefs are and what you understand to be true.
Well, that's a big topic to
Mhm.
go over. I've been an astrologer for over 60 years. I'm most well known because I was the first person to computerize astrology. There was no, before the work that I did in the company that I started, which was called Matrix Software. And Matrix was often thought of as a mathematical term, but I was using it as its original Greek, which meant a womb out of which the future of astrology would come. And I was not mathematical. In school, math was my worst subject, but in order to program astrology, I had to learn a lot of mathematics. And it used to really irritate me with astrologers who used to say, oh, I'm the nerdy kind of guy that programmed it. So thank you for the programs, Mr. Erlewine, but leave the interpreting to us. We'll tell you what it means. And I said, wait a minute, I'm not primarily a mechanic, and I don't just and I didn't get into astrology just because I wanted to program it. It was all very hard for me to do because I never got out of high school. And even when I was in school, I hated school. And so I never, unless I had a good teacher, I wouldn't listen. And so, in my lifetime, I've followed my own personal interests. I was raised out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, way out between two large farms. And my parents built our house. So there was no other houses. I had younger brothers, but they were younger brothers. I had no one to share much with or to do much with except Mother Nature. So I became very skilled at natural science. I became a naturalist. And so that and this was about when I was 6 years old that I began to really do this. And by the time I was in my teens, I'd had a little tiny office made for me in the University of Michigan Museums building just because I was really precocious about my interest was in herpetology, reptiles, amphibians. And so anyway, my point is that throughout my life, I have followed my interest rather than anything else. That rather than graduate from high school, rather than go to college, although I was accepted at Michigan just because I took some tests, but I went to it for three weeks, and I just decided, gee, this is just more of the same stuff. I just want to go out and be in the world and hang out. All I really wanted to do was, I guess what I'm, what basically I am is someone who monitors my own life stream. And so with astrology, I mean, I talked to you a little bit about, and I can go into it in great detail about how I programmed astrology on computers when they became available in 1977 for people like myself. But before that, we had 4 function calculators that appeared about 1972. So I was doing astrology on those calculators and then later in programmable calculators, because programming replaced the way astrology charts were made before that, which were with trig tables and then log tables and lookup ephemerides, ephemerides. So I took all that and put it on a computer. And then, gee, I was so excited about it that I shared it with my fellow astrologers, and I was just getting known. And they liked it. So that I ended up and this was all on cassette tapes. There were no disk drives or anything like that. There was no printers. I had a 65-pound teletype machine that I had to write my own word processing routine to justify type on. There wasn't anything like that. And I ended up having to record and verify tapes all day long, because astrologers increasingly wanted to have copies of what I was doing. And I was giving them away free because I was just excited. But after a while, I reached a point where, I had little kids that I wasn't making. First of all, I never made enough money, but I had to begin charging for the software. And pretty soon that turned into a software company. And in fact, according to an article in Red Herring magazine on me, there's only one older software company in existence, still in existence on the internet, and that's a little company called Microsoft. So I was like the second software company, although a really small one relative to Microsoft. So that just tells you a little bit about why astrologers like me. In fact, a couple of years ago, I was at a conference in Chicago of a couple thousand astrologers, or whatever number they were, for a week. And toward the end, they have a big ballroom thing where you have a big dinner. And I was, first of all, I have to be careful with what I eat. And the stuff they serve there is pretty awful stuff. And also, I just didn't like the ballroom scene and stuff. And so that they finally announced they were giving one of, I think, only a couple Lifetime Achievement Awards. And they gave one to me, and there was like a standing ovation for 5 minutes, I'm told, but I was already up in bed, sound asleep, because I had snuck out of the ballroom early on because it wasn't my cup of tea. And so I received that award in my pajamas. So that was pretty funny. To me, that's funny. So that you can, anyway, I don't know, I can go in 100 different directions, but I'm saying that's how I got to be well known as an astrologer. And it's only later, my own astrology is almost all out of my own mind. That I did a lot of interviewing in Chicago that time. I think I published 24 interviews with astrologers on YouTube. And one of them was totally offended because he asked me who were the ones that I learned from. And I pointed out one whose name is Dr. Theodore Landscheid, who was a great, but I said I didn't really learn from anyone else. I had the largest astrology library in the world, which I donated to the University of Illinois a number of years ago, which I no longer have it, but I sent you a picture of it.
Yes.
It was really immense. It took a Allied Van Lines giant moving van just to move it, a UPS truck just to move my papers and notes and stuff. So now I lost my train of thought. What was I saying?
You were just talking about how that someone was offended by the way that you had, how you had learned on your own.
Well, no, yeah, this was a guy, I won't say his name because I don't think he certainly meant well, but he was offended that that I wasn't calling out all these guys that I owed homage to. Of course, I loved all these guys. I mean, I knew almost everyone. That all the great astrologers, Dane Ruddier and right on down the line, had been to my home, stayed with me, ate with me, talked with me. But as far as who did I learn from, almost all the astrological techniques, like what example would be a technique called local space. It's like relocation astrology, how to move around on the surface of the earth. All of these came out of my mind. The Tibetans have a word called terma, which are basically mind treasures. And the one who finds terma in our own mind are called tertons. And we could talk about that at some point because it's absolutely fascinating. But I found it much easier, even though I had more books than probably any astrologer ever had. I found it easier to go into my own mind and to mine and bring out new astrological techniques. And those things are now only beginning to become known. Some of them are like local space, the relocation technique is in all modern software and a couple other things that I've done. But most of it's not, because it's very hard to understand. First of all, astrology is based on astronomy. If it's not based on astronomy, it's not astrology. It might be psychic this or psychic that, and that's all wonderful. I also spent quite a bit of time with psychics learning about all of that, which we could talk about. But any real astrology is kind of, it's been called cultural astronomy. It's the culture of astronomy. The astronomical events like a new moon or the conjunction of two planets, that's the astronomy of it. What it means, what do those things mean? That's what astrology is about. So maybe you have some questions to point. I mean, that's just a general idea of what is astrology. That's what it is. It's cultural astronomy.
I find it fascinating, and I love what you're touching on there, and it's something I would like to go into. And it sounds almost as if you're talking about some kind of inner knowledge or an intuition, or almost as if, and I know this term gets thrown around a lot, but like a channeling, or a lot of people describe it as a removal of a filter or an unlearning.
Yeah,
in some respects, and I find that fascinating, and I do love talking about that, and I feel like I've had experiences like that in my life, but I also read a lot of great teachers have talked about this, and so we can go either way with that. We can continue on with that and how that manifests.
Well, let's talk about that.
Yes, please.
First of all the ways you described it, I understand. I mean, it makes a sense, channeling and so on, but to me, it's much easier than that. The mind that we all have, or that we all share, however we want to put it, it simply is never looked at directly by us. It's kind of like we use the light in our mind, the light that allows us to be talking like this or reading a page. It's like we use it like a flashlight to look at stuff. We're looking outward, but we never turn the light in on itself. The light never looks at itself, and we never look at the light directly because it's too bright. We would need sunglasses, or like when you watch a solar eclipse, we need those heavy, heavy, heavy things because we are too sensitive. We can't take a whole lot of light at once. However, aside from studying astrology, and I really have studied astrology for 60 years, and I'm really an expert in it, in the ways that I am an expert in it. But as but the Dharma, what we call Buddhism, it's not Buddhism, it's Buddhism, Buddha. What that is about is a whole nother world. The way my Dharma teacher, who was a 96-year-old, 95 or 96-year-old Tibetan who never spoke English, I was with him for 36 years, working closely with him, never could really talk to him except through a translator. But the way he presented was that, and he said it like he knew that I loved astrology. In fact, he came to our center and gave a wonderful talk just on astrology, on the Buddhist view of astrology, which was totally enlightening because he talked about how the winds and the channels within our body, what we call the chakras and stuff, how they line up at new and full moon and how they become in almost perfect alignment at eclipses. So this was like blowing my mind just to have him explain this. But the way he explained it to me was that he said, Michael, you start with that. He'd say that to a translator, he said, astrology is one of the limbs of the yoga, but it's not the root. Dharma is the root. And astrology is just one of the forms of Dharma, of the limbs of Dharma, and all the Tibetans. And I've been to Tibet twice, and I met lots and lots of Rinpoches and Tibetans and stuff. And they all use astrology. They don't know how to calculate it, like I had to do, but they all use it to not to figure out their inner life and stuff like that, but just to calculate when to have certain events happen and when to practice certain Dharma practices and stuff like that. And so I spent a lot of time quizzing. Back in the 80s, all of the great lamas in our tradition, which is the Karma Kagyu tradition, most people know the Dalai Lama, and I met the Dalai Lama early on personally. He's part of a group called the Gelupas, and he's the 14th Dalai Lama, but my tradition is called Karma Kagyu, and our leader, who's like the Dalai Lama, is called the Karmapa, and he's the 17th Karmapa. So that our tradition is the oldest reincarnate Lama tradition. So that's where that came from. And I traveled with my family in 1997. I took almost all my kids, one was in college, all the way to his ancestral home, which is called Sirpu Monastery at 15,000 feet. And I met the young Karmapa. And then later, in recent years, I've been on video crews working with him a number of times and that kind of stuff. Now I wandered off again. Where was I headed?
Well, we were talking about the tradition that you came from.
Yeah, I did a little.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know we were talking about just
Tirtans.
Yes, we were talking about, the openness. For me, I get interested in that because I feel like in many occasions now in my life, especially as I'm getting older and I'm more open to it. I was very resistant to this before, but it's when you talked about the flashlight and how it's almost too bright to look inside.
It's right there now.
Yes.
Right? We're not looking at it. In fact, we're trained not to look at it. According to the Buddhists, for many, many lifetimes, we have taken refuge not in the Dharma, but in what's called samsara, in the process of being entertained, but not looking at the source of light itself. And that's, yeah, I'm glad that we make a good combination, because you remember where I was headed better than I do, because so that's really useful for me. So anyway, the point is that there are ways and there are methods and practices, meditation practices, and, practicing meditation or practicing Dharma, or Dharma people say, I'm doing my practice. That's what they're doing. They're practicing. They're not really meditating yet. That idea. So learning to begin to look at that light, or we could, a little less than that would be starting to turn the flashlight of our own interest, our own looking inward on itself. First of all, it's not simple, not easy to do. And certainly because we have a habit of many lifetimes, so I'm told, of not doing it, not looking at it at all, because it was just we found it too hard to do. It was much easier just to ignore it and have the twilight kind of world that we have, which is kind of like a dream, than to really look at the source. Where does that come from? What is the nature of our own mind? And to learn about the nature of the mind, as far as I know, is difficult. I mean, really difficult. And it even takes, in our tradition, it takes working with an authentic Lama, Rinpoche. And we have what are called the pointing out instructions as to the nature of the mind. And that teacher, that authentic teacher, someone that you would have confidence in, they are able to help us redirect the flashlight so that we can actually look at, the way my teacher would say it was, he would introduce us, introduction to the nature of the mind, so that we have what's called, so that we recognize it. It's like a figure ground thing. You ever see those old paintings where there's a painting and then somewhere in the painting is a tiny, tiny, another image, but you can't find it. It's not just like finding Waldo or something like that. You really can't see it unless someone points it out to you. But once it's pointed out, you can see it from then on. That's what's called, in the Dharma training I do and have been in, recognition. Once you recognize how the mind works, once you recognize it, you can begin to become familiar with it and work it yourself to your own ends. I mean, your own ends would be to become more and more aware. So that's just, so anyway, just jumping back into astrology for a second, I learned to do that with astrology, to go into the mind. First of all, since I had thousands and tens of thousands of books and magazines, I looked through as many of those as I could stand. Many of them are just junk. But I found it in the long term much easier to go into the mind itself and to find stuff that's hidden there, that's never been uncovered, to my knowledge. And I was able only to do a little bit of it, to pull out just a few techniques that have never been used, and then you don't just pull it out and give it to people, because it doesn't work like that. You have to find it, then you have to fully realize it for yourself. Only when you've realized it could you then empower others to understand it, because these techniques are like freeze-dried Dharma, something that they're the very essence. A technique is the essence of a whole process. And you have to add realization to that freeze-dried stuff in order for it to become real, to be realized. Then you could share it with others. I mean, I'm certainly capable. I'm not a Rinpoche, and I don't try to do what Rinpoches do, but in astrology, I am empowered, and I know how to empower these techniques that I discovered because I've realized them more than just an intellectual exercise, that idea. So,
yes. So, and I think what we were talking about a minute ago, in something that fascinates me, And if I could kind of just go back a little bit and talk about something we talked briefly about before we started
Sure.
the recording.
Yeah,
Um,
anything.
yeah, when I first became aware of this way of thinking, it was the early days of podcasting for me. It was when I realized that there were podcasts and what they were. I started listening to someone had placed some old recordings of Osho, who was a self-described teacher, came over from India, and he was. I listened to, I would say, hundreds of hours of his talks.
It's a lot.
I was absolutely obsessed with them. I drive a lot for my work, and I was in the car listening to this, and this is where my podcasting love affair started. And after listening to him for quite a while, I started to get that sense. I started to understand that there was much more. I had started having questions about my consciousness and where that came from and what it was and what it meant to be alive and what it meant to incarnate in this realm, if you will. And eventually I had this, I want to say like a spike, a breakthrough moment where I felt like I rose above the clouds and I could see everything the way that it was. I was feeling the state of bliss, if you will. It was so fleeting that I have chills thinking about it now. And it was at that point, I was a realized Buddha. I had it all figured out for about 5 minutes. And
Hey,
eventually I came back to reality and crashed down to the ground. but I was,
we all do.
it was enough to start my interest on this path forever. It will never go away. And what I've come to realize is that, and I've accepted this and I embrace it now, is that the more things I learn, the more concepts I understand. When you talk about these freeze-dried moments, these teachings that are to be passed down and to be used as kind of guideposts, if you will, they can answer a question that you have, but they seem to invoke even more questions, like a bigger mystery behind those that just never stops. And it feels like the more I dig, the deeper the teachings that are out there, and the bigger they are, and the more immense and the more beautiful they are. And again, I've reached that state of bliss many times just by surrendering into that mystery, if you will.
Sure.
Yeah, and I find but it also just keeps my intellectual curiosities going, and just that it seems like it'll never be quenched, and that's beautiful, and it's fine, and I know that I'll never understand it in this lifetime. I've come to accept that, but it does feel as if some of these teachings didn't start here, and so I would love to go into staying in this track. When you talk about reincarnation, when you talk about living other lifetimes, it's something I've come to accept as a very real possibility, if not truth. I think maybe it is true. But I would love to get your understanding of how it works.
Sure. I got it. Yeah, I mean, maybe some of this came from your meeting Acharya Rajneesh. I have no idea, but let's talk about, there's a big difference, and there's a difference. First of all, I don't know that there's a difference. Because I don't know, I've programmed Vedic astrology, Hindu astrology, and I had the first 2 Hindu astrology conferences in America at my center. But my understanding is that there's quite a bit of difference between reincarnation and rebirth. And when we talk about the Dalai Lama or the Karmapa, these great figures, they are said to be actual reincarnation enough so that it's pretty much that the same mind continues from life to life. But the rest of us, that'd be you and myself and all the people we know, are not said to be reincarnated. We are said to take rebirth. And the difference is that at the end of our life, when we die, all of that personality, all that's personal, what we call the self, that's just left at the death's door, like in a heap. So what moves on? So it's not so that Michael Erlewine, that's me, won't be Michael Erlewine continued in the next lifetime. But what will continue are my karma, different things, different desires, different things that I've set in motion through my own actions that have to, at some point, evoke a response. And a lot of that response is not going to, like, let's say at the last day of before your death, you do something terrible, like murder someone or do something like that. No time for you to get your just desserts from that in this lifetime. So it's going to have to be somewhere in the future. But it's not quite that simple.
Mm-hmm.
But my understanding it is there's what is called in Buddhism, the storehouse consciousness, alaya vijnana. In the alaya are all our actions that demand responses, that demand a continued existence, stripped of all our personality. That is what will continue, and that it continues into what are called the bardo. First of all, we're in the bardo now. There's many different bardos, but the bardo after death and the bardo that leads to rebirth, those actions that we set in motion, but it's not we anymore, it's just those actions, they are going to, as the bardo experience is resolved, depending on how it's resolved, and that would be another whole discussion, we are going to choose a womb and parents, and we're going to be reborn in a new situation, in a new city, new DNA, new body, the whole thing. Those continuing cravings that we have, those things that we set in motion, they are going to create around themselves an entirely new personality based on our DNA, parents, all that. So I will be a completely different person, but still the same directions that I set in motion through all of the lives I've lived up to now. So that the disappointing thing is that, unlike some of the Hindu traditions, it's not going to be me again. Like I know myself to the degree I do know myself, but it's going to be, as I described, my situation, my cravings drawing around themselves a whole new set of clothes, so to speak, a whole new personality, a whole new situation, and continuing from that. I don't know if that's helpful to you, but that's the way that that Tibetan Buddhism, for the most part, looks at it.
And would that be, to help my understanding, would that be that essence, if you will, of your perhaps
essence of what?
Yeah, like what is this, the higher self, or is this a soul concept?
It's in Buddhism, the self and the soul are constructs. There are things that it's kind of like yourself is kind of like your personal secretary that helps you remember to go to the doctor, but it also gets carried away with itself and gets you in all kinds of cravings and stuff. You want this and you want that. All of that kind of stuff does not last through the gate of death. All that stuff is abandoned except for the basic craving themselves. So this whole idea of that's why many of the Buddhist teachings say there is no self. That's a mistranslation. It's not that there is no self, because we can look in the meaning in a mirror and see that we have a self, it means that what it really means is there's no permanent self that's going to be reborn. That you're going to have to learn to live with. And that's a tough nut to crack, right? A hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
But that's the way the Buddhists look at it. We're going to have to give up. That's what the Buddhists have. One of the introductions to Buddhism are what are called the four thoughts. The four thoughts that turn the mind, also called the four thoughts that turn the mind toward the Dharma, sometimes called the four reminders.
Mm-hmm.
And those four thoughts, I can just say briefly, because this is what got me into Dharma. Because I was raised Roman Catholic like you were, and I was an altar boy and all that stuff, and it was totally gross. But when I encountered the four thoughts that turn the mind, all I could look at is say, did you ever see Groundhog Day?
Yes.
Well, in the Groundhog Day, Bill Murray says when his girlfriend is trying to say what she's looking for, he says, "Oh, that's me." And then he says, "Oh, me again. Me," he's sort of saying, I'm that. Now I lost my train of thought again. Sorry.
No, it's okay. The four reminders.
Oh yeah, just the four reminders. So the four reminders, when I first read them, I just sort of said like the Bill Murray, "Oh, that's me. That's exactly what I've been thinking.
Mhm.
That's what I've always been thinking." And that's how I became a Buddhist. So the four thoughts are pretty simple. The first thought is, this life that you have, that we have, is precious. Don't waste it. Be used for some good purpose. That's the first thought. The second thought is impermanence. This life is fragile like a soap bubble. It can pop in a moment. Again, don't waste it, but recognize how delicate and how precious this living life that we have is. The third thought is called karma. Everything we do, every act we take, the consequences of it are inexorable. There's no way of defeating or outwitting. It's like, as smart as we are, we can never sneak up on a mirror, right? It's kind of like that. There's no way that we can sneak up on it, nor is there any way we can outwit karma. So, and the fourth thought, which was the hard one for me to understand, is translated in many ways, but it's mostly translated as the revulsion of this life that we're now living, which is never very hard for me to say because I love this life that I'm living, especially as a young person. What did they mean? What they really meant, and the way I teach it when I teach it, is that no matter what you do or what I do in this life, we will never, ever get all our ducks in a row. We're never going to solve that problem. And the sooner that we figure that out, then we begin to look to other solutions. But as long as we think that we can game the system, we're part of that system, that idea. So those are the four thoughts that turn the mind toward the Dharma and away from just whiling our time away until we die. That idea.
Yes, I mean, that's very powerful, and thank you for helping me with that understanding. I've struggled with that concept too, but again, I think when I've tasted that truth, it's that surrender into that.
Right.
Yeah, and understanding that you're never going to get there, and not in this,
that way.
Yeah, not like this.
And like you said before, that when we have a moment of true insight, like you did, and we come down from it, because we certainly come down to it because we cannot maintain it, because we don't have the structure, the infrastructure to hold it together. That's when we start to look around for infrastructures like Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. In my case, it was Buddhism, because for the reasons I just said. When I saw those four thoughts, I was already thinking something like that myself. I knew my life was precious. I didn't want to screw it up and waste it. And I also knew that because of my study of nature, watching all the earthworms try to cross a tarmac when the sun came up, and realizing that some of them were even crawling in the direction of the road, they're never going to make it. Impermanence is totally, we're surrounded by Mother Nature, is absolutely doesn't blink. If you study nature, it's pure, I don't know, it's totally direct. It's a great teacher. In fact, in Buddhism, they have a thing called the Lama of appearances, just like the Lama of the Dharma teacher, right? Nature can also teach us inexorably the truth, that idea. So anyway, what I started out to say is that if we have an experience like you have, after that, we begin to look around for some ways to build a support, some kind of stability, so that we could have that kind of experience on a regular basis or permanently. And that's how we get into stuff like that, because we would never forget that experience, because it's from that we measure who we are. That's the most important thing. But that's, again, falling into the idea of ourself as who we are. But that experience, that is, aside from the self, is who we are. I mean, in the sense that that's where you're headed. And that's where each of us are headed, who takes a spiritual direction of one kind or another. And there's no, like the Buddhists say, there's 84,000 dharmas. Just means that we're all different. And we're each going to have a path. It's in Dharma, it's called your yidam. Yidam is just basically the particular path that you must travel to become enlightened. Totally different than mine. So we can't even share that, not because it's secret, but because the way I teach that is like we're all on a bus driving through town, and we reach my bus stop, and I get off the bus, but I walk to my house, and you get off the bus and you walk to your house. Your yidam is walking to your own house. Is your particular dharma that's going to work so that you wake up. That idea. So.
Yeah, I found myself coming to a concept of I think one of the surrendering points is a forgiveness to myself, kind of giving myself a break, if you will, for falling down along that path. You know, when I see the concept of, I think, right action would be one of the ones that would resonate with you. And it was a quote that I've talked about on my podcast that struck me as a young child, actually, was Maya Angelou. And when she said, when you know better, do better. And it was one of those things where it turned into the concept of integrity, and it turned into a concept of forgiveness for your previous incarnation, if you will, in this life, an older version of yourself that, you know, didn't know better. But and it's become something I've imparted into my children and tried to impart in my community, you know, as an example, not necessarily preaching it, but just, okay, so now what do we do? We've had this problem, we've had this issue. Now, how do we grow from it, instead of beating ourselves up about it and not having that forgiveness? And I think that's important for me. It's been a concept for me. I think you're kind of alluding to that there. The idea of a collective consciousness. And I think that is really something that's fascinatingly coming into the scientific community, if you will, in a lot of ways, when they're talking about the quantum field, when we're talking about interdimensionalities. What I find fascinating when I read recently, I've been fascinated with the works of Paramhansa Yogananda and reading the Bhagavad Gita and things along these paths, or along these lines. And when I'm reading their descriptions of reality, if you will, how they're meshing with our current scientific emerging understanding. I think we're just scratching the surface with these concepts, to be honest. But it really starts to sound like someone 3,000 years ago knew how to describe what we're starting to discover now as the materialistic truth of our reality and how mysterious it truly is. And I don't know how much time you spend thinking about that. But I think you've probably already accepted this before this stuff. But as a previously not so long ago material atheist, this has been a very helpful concept for me, especially talking to other people about it.
Have you read the writings of Sir Edwin Arnold on the Bhagavad Gita, called The Light of Asia?
I have not. I've been reading different translations lately.
This is a very beautiful one.
Yeah.
It's very good poetry.
And what was the name of him?
It's called The Light of Asia, and his name was Sir Edwin Arnold.
All right.
And it's just, yeah, I mean, it's all good, as they say. So
yeah, I've found, I'm actually listening to my second translation now. It's a 19-hour audio book, but the first one I listened to was just over 5 hours, and I found it so beautiful. But then I was reading that and hearing that there were so many different translations.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
This one you can find it online, I think, free, and just read it.
Yeah, I think I might do that. Thank you.
I don't know that I'd want to hear someone recite anything because
I,
my mind is good to read, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm building my library. I have nothing nearly as, and that's what I've been doing now for the past, since 2012. Prior to 2012, I think I read since I left school. I was forced to read through college by necessity, but I really had a long lull where I was not interested in knowledge. I was completely absorbed in my own life and just jumping from crisis to crisis, if you will. And now I'm a voracious reader. I love to read and I love to buy books and I love to own them and to keep them forever, apparently. So
I'm on the other end of that. I mean, I'm shedding all of the things I own rapidly just because I'm getting ready to pass on. I mean, what can I say? I'm 80.
yeah.
So I don't read at all other than Dharma texts or online. I write. I must say, I write an essay a day. That takes a lot of time. So,
and this conversation it has I think you're probably insulated enough from it, but I know how much time you've spent working on developing a healthy ego. But talking to me, I am a huge fan of yours. I really appreciate your work. I love your writings. I'm impressed, and there's so many little interesting things that people I think would be interesting just to mention from a perspective, of a fan. But you've spent a lot of time getting to know a lot of the greats, particularly in the music industry. You actually had a very successful band, the Prime Movers. And wasn't Iggy Pop part of your band at one point?
Iggy Pop was our drummer. In fact,
Yeah.
we gave him the name Iggy. He came from a band called Iguanas, which was a frat band. And we kind of looked down on frat bands because we were part of the new kind of bands like the Grateful Dead. And it all happened in 1965 for us, and same for Grateful Dead. So that we called him Iguana for our first few days. And then it shortened to Iggy, and he liked it. And so that's how it became Iggy Pop. But he was he was a good drummer, not a great drummer. He was great for us. I mean, he learned to do what's called the double shuffle, which is a blues drumming technique that's very difficult. And he can become good at it. And that's what all the great blues guys can do. And he did it. And it wasn't that too long ago, we thought of maybe getting together, but he says he's lost all his chops. Can't really drum anymore, but he was a good drummer. So yeah, anyway, he was a part of our band, and he went on and become the Psychedelic Stooges.
Yes. The rest is
yeah, I was very involved in Black music. That's mostly my study. And in Black music, I was a specialist in blues. And I think that I've interviewed either by audio or video audio, almost all the great blues players that you could name personally. I did scores and scores and scores of them, or their families, or their sidemen, and the sidemen and stuff like that. So that I went through an intense time where all I did is study Black music, and totally respectfully. And I tried to play, but never arrogantly. Just it was something before I found, here's a way of saying it, before I found the Dharma and Rinpoches and Tibetan Rinpoches, my heroes were Black blues men and women. They were people that I went to learn from, not just to learn the music, but to learn about life, because they knew a lot more about life than I had ever been exposed to. And a lot of it's tragic and so regrettable, but great people like Roosevelt Sykes or Big Mama Thornton or Big Boy Crudup. These are great beings, that I got to like. Big Boy Crudup wrote Elvis Presley's first song, "That's All Right, Mama." I remember that when we put on one of the, do you have to get that or something? Was that some?
No,
I heard a noise. Okay,
I
anyway,
was hoping you didn't hear that.
no, it's okay. But when we put on the first Ann Arbor Blues Festival, and then the second one in 1969, we didn't put it on, but we were the only ones that knew all these guys, and it had been Chicago and stuff like that, so that we were chosen to take care of all these players. Taking care of meant we served them food and especially alcohol. So we had a lot of access because they wanted to eat and they certainly wanted to drink. And so that I just spent hours and hours. I remember one night we went up and they began to come to the concert up to a week early. I don't know how they did that or why. They would just show up, and they were housed by the University of Michigan. Big Boy Crudup was housed in what's called a Michigan League. And I remember that my brother Dan and I, we started our band, we did together, went up to Big Boy Crudup's room one night, knocked on the door, and he was a huge guy, came to the door, and you opened the door, and Dan opened his vest, and there was a bottle of Jack Daniels. And he just said, "Come on in, boys." And we spent hours talking with him. And we did the same with Big Mama Thornton and the same with dozens of them. We sat, but like in the West Quad, in these little tiny quad bedrooms, we would sit on the floor. There's just a little bed, and there's one of these great people like Johnny Shines. And we would just, bathe in their knowledge and their kindness. And there was also certain amounts of racist stuff that wasn't easy to bridge. But these great beings, they were totally beyond that, which they had no reason to be beyond it. They just were. So
I love hearing stories like that of people. What you did there was you had an inclination or a desire and you followed it. You followed your heart, even though that could be something that would be rather intimidating for a lot of people. And I try to tell them,
why wouldn't we follow our heart though?
That's a great question, Michael. It's a very good question. I was going to go back to that, actually, something you said at the beginning of this, and I was going to ask about your upbringing a little bit. The fact that you grew up in nature and that you kind of had nature as a surrounding you, so that you were immersed in it, and that
right.
you mentioned that from a very early age you kind of understood that you wanted to follow your interests. That is something that I think our culture as a whole is like, well, yeah, you can do that, but you have to do this first. You have to go to college. You have to get a career.
Exactly.
A lot of pressure from parents. So I was going to ask about your upbringing a little bit. Were your parents very supportive, or was this
my parents were very supportive, but first of all, I don't think they knew much about who I was in the intensity of who I am. I mean, they were totally supportive. But I think the thing to take away from this is that I grew up because we were way out on the farm and we built our own house. My father had it built. There were no neighbors. We were stuck between two large farms. And I had 4 younger brothers eventually, but they were younger brothers. I couldn't turn to them for wisdom and stuff because they turned to me for wisdom, where I was the oldest. So what I did turn to is Mother Nature, and I became very, very good at it. So good at that when I got in my teens, I was, paid to collect for the University of Michigan. I was given a little tiny office back in the stacks of all these pickled creatures because I was really good at it. But the point is that I learned nature's laws well before I discovered man's laws. And I could never be comfortable with man's laws because they were unrealistic. They were good for being social, I guess. But nature doesn't brook mistakes. We don't break nature's laws; they break us. So then, when I begin to discover, especially educationally, when I was going to school and finding out, whoa, this stuff's not at all interesting as nature is. This is like really some crude stuff that they're doing to me. So that's the concept. That's the idea. I never adjusted to man's laws or man and women's laws. I already knew a law system that was unforgiving, but also totally fair to all. So obviously I couldn't exist and be totally that. So that I had to learn whatever I had to learn to live and not be locked away or something. But if somebody asked me, like you did, where I'm coming from learning nature's laws before I learned civil law. And I've been polite as I can, but I'm not fooled by going along just to get along. I never did. I never could work for anyone that I didn't want to work for. And I could never, ever be taught by anyone that I did not have a life respect for, like I did with these Black players. I respected them like you would a Rinpoche or a priest. They were everything I wanted to be. I didn't want to have to drink and have no money and have the lives that they had to live. But for many years, those were my, like you mentioned Yogananda, those were the pole star in my life. And then when I found the Dharma, it became the wisdom of the Rinpoches and the great lamas like the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa. They didn't have some of the other problems, but they had the same kind of wisdom.
I love that train of thought, and I feel it's very tragic how many of these lives go, and I think that there's a reason for it, and something I've come to believe is without that focus of what they're tapping into. I believe that I have a general respect for artists because I believe that they're following something where they're trying to describe the ineffable with their art, things that are not really we can't articulate with our language effectively. So, and a lot of people are very close to being able to do that. Some of our great poets, authors, yourself, people that can master the craft of writing, but I don't think we can ever get to a certain place with our limited language. And I think that artists tap into something, and specifically for me, and I know that people would argue and say that painters can do this as well, or whatever, or sculptors, but particularly music, because of my beliefs around vibration and energy. I believe that people that can speak to us through music are doing something very lofty and something that's a little bit, I want to say more, something a little higher vibrationally, if you will. And I think that when someone can do that, when they taste that, but they're spending all their time there without following those guideposts that the Karmapa tradition might give them, it's pretty easy to get lost and overwhelmed. And I think a lot of artists succumb to that.
I think that I would agree with you, except that I would say that from what I understand, there is liberation through hearing. That's the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But there's also liberation through seeing. And there's liberation through all of the senses, one by one. Some are more easily communicated and shared, like music, but certainly looking at great art. I mean, when I got into some of my little tiny bit of actual realization, it wasn't liberation through hearing. It was liberation through seeing. Because of all the time I'd spent looking at Mother Nature, I was out in nature, not sitting on a cushion like I thought it would be. I thought I'm sitting on the cushion for 36 years. Something should happen. It didn't work that way because it actually took me back to nature, which I had grown up in, but hadn't done a whole lot with because nature's so painful to be close to because of the death and the impermanence of everything is so in your face that when it came time for me to actually have a little realization, it was out in nature, the last place I would have thought of it, that I was able to do what's called insight meditation, finally. Total surprise, not at all what I expected, but that's kind of where I came from. So I went back to where I came from, and then I'm most comfortable. But I don't spend a lot of time with nature now, just because I don't. I mean, I go for walks and I photograph nature and stuff like that, but you can't go home again. Things change. And so now what I'm trying to do is just share some of my experiences a lot, while I still can.
We thank you for it. We really do. And I find, and I want to agree with you. I think I should have worded it a little bit better. I think is what resonates with me the most is music. And that's been my experience. But I have been touched, by nature as well. I grew up in this area. I live in Stanwood now, but my grandparents lived in Macasta when I was a kid. They moved up here.
Right, really?
Yeah. So they lived out by Pretty Lake.
Yep, I know it all.
Yeah. So we grew up and there was a little campground behind our house called Bluegill Lake Campground. And I grew up there in the summers and I lived with my grandparents periodically as I was growing up. And so I was the oldest child as well. So I was quite often on my own, and there was just a lot of freedom back then. The kids can't run like they used to. And I was 5 years old and I was on my bike and I was out in the woods and I was down at the lake swimming and, be home for dinner,
Right. Me too.
Yeah. And, nature is always, sometimes I like to just sit and it always catches my attention when I'll hear the buzzing of the insects in the trees, and I'll just listen to the leaves blowing, and it's almost as if I dissolve into it. And I realize how a part of it we all are, and that there's a bliss state that comes from that for me.
I agree.
And I just love it. I had an experience over the weekend, Michael, that you brought back to me as you were talking, and we had a music festival. We started our own music festival. Some friends and I, we've been planning it for 2 years. And this past weekend was that festival. It's called
cool.
River Rhythm. And we had an amazing time. It went better than we could have ever dreamed that it would have went. Our artist, our lineup, everything was just perfect. And we're not quite big enough to get May yet, but we're working on it.
Well, she's pretty, she's harder to get now just because she can't travel as much because she has a daughter, and she loves that daughter.
Yes, she does.
Totally. And we babysit that daughter a lot. So
we're working on it. We're going to get there. And before I forget, I wanted to tell you something you had said about nature. And we had a realization that on Friday night of our festival around dark, we got swarmed with insects.
Wow.
And they weren't just the normal insects. The mayflies had hatched.
Oh, that was beautiful.
They were absolutely beautiful, and they were everywhere. And we were like, oh no, like you can't even stand out here because if you have any light on at all, they're just flocking to you.
But they won't hurt you.
They won't hurt you. It was just, people were a little freaked out by it, but and it subsided over after an hour or so. And I went I was kind of messing around in the dark, and I had a flashlight, and I was going to my camping boxes and stuff. And there was a mayfly, and they, because they die. They die really quick.
They don't, yeah, I know.
Yeah. And it was sitting on my camping box, and it was this beautiful, right in the middle. I got really up close to it, and it was still fluttering, and it was kind of alive, but you could tell it was kind of reaching the end. And I shined my flashlight on it, and it looked like an angel.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
And I could almost, I started to cry. And I was like talking to this beautiful little insect about letting go and going back into the oneness in the universe. And it was just a touching moment but it was that feeling of being at one with nature and how expansive this understanding can truly be. And I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with that, but it's just an image that came back for me in a moment that I had over the weekend,
Well, you're obviously very sensitive. No, that kind of stuff is good. It's good to help you be more pliable, be able to exercise. It's a kind of exercise, but it's, I always like that kind of stuff myself, of course, right?
Yeah.
And I do it too. Whenever I can. Right? So
absolutely beautiful. And so, I mean, there's still so many topics, and I love your idea of perhaps doing another follow-up, but I did want to talk a little bit about what your daughter May has meant to my life. I don't think I've touched on this yet. I discovered her music many years ago. I do believe she's a treasure. I think she's a treasure. She's one of my favorite singer-songwriters of all time. I listen to her music literally daily because she's on all my playlists that I create. So I tell people about her music. I travel to see her play. I've sat many times at festivals in the front row, with my legs crossed in the front row with tears just pouring down my face.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing what she does. And I'm sure as a father, I'm sure pride isn't one of your favorite words, but you really can't help but have a little bit of that, I wouldn't think.
Oh, I don't have any trouble with pride. I mean, I'm very proud of all four of my kids. They each have blown my mind in their own particular way. I don't know, it made me so proud of them, right? And fulfilled something in me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, May is amazing. That's all. And she works really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say. I mean, like I said, I just posted a lot of photos I took of May, which are really good photos of her during a very special time. And you can see it in the photos. But yeah, I'd be glad to do this again. If you find it interesting, there are many areas that I know something about that might be interesting to others.
Yes.
We touched on a couple of them, but there's lots of them. I didn't realize how active I was, but I have been very active.
Yes, you have. Yeah, I've like I said, I've admired you from afar. This has been just a treat for me personally, and it's kind of, I've got this out of my system now, so I hope this went well for you.
It went really good, and I'd like to get a copy of the recording somehow, however that's done.
Yeah, I can definitely shoot you that. I'll be releasing this in the next week, but I can also send you the file if you'd like.
Yeah, and then send me your links, and I may post some of it on my blog, which reaches a bunch of people.
That'd be wonderful.
But I think it's a good combination. If you want to talk again, I'm up for it because you're sincere about your questions and you're sensitive enough to find your way to the right questions. And I've done a lot of interviews, but this is a good one. I mean, you're right on the money. So let's do it again.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, there goes the chills. Thank you so much. I have a great deal of respect for you, sir, and I'm
Well,
looking forward to talking to you again.
well, it's nice to meet you, and we'll sign off if I can remember how to do that. All right, see
Thank
you
you,
again.
thank you,
Bye-bye.
Mike. Take care.
Okay.